"Here's the hoodie and a $70 card," my husband's sister, the CO, said with a smirk as she fired me and kept my $270,000 bonus. I left without a word. But at the Series BAM meeting, the lead investor opened my file, looked at her, and said something that changed everything. $70. That's what my sister-in-law Sydney decided I was worth after 4 years of building her fashion empire from nothing. She slid the burgundy hoodie across the conference table with the gift card tucked into its pocket, her manicured nails tapping against the glass as she waited for me to take it. "We appreciate everything you've done, Aubrey," she said, though her smirk suggested otherwise. My husband Connor sat 3 chairs away, studying his phone like it contained the secrets of the universe, his wedding ring catching the afternoon light. I picked up the hoodie, feeling its cheap polyester between my fingers, and realized this wasn't just a termination. It was a declaration of war she didn't know she'd started. Before we dive deeper, if you've ever been undervalued at work or watched someone take credit for your efforts, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps these important stories reach others who need to hear them. But 3 years earlier, that same conference table didn't exist. Neither did the office or the company or Sydney's delusions of being a fashion mogul. Back then, we worked from the 600-square-foot apartment Connor and I rented above Washmore Dry Cleaners on Madison Street. The place was a disaster. Floors that creaked with every step, windows painted shut by decades of careless landlords, and vents that carried up the permanent smell of pressing chemicals and fabric softener. But it was ours, and it was where Lumiere fashion began. Every morning at 5, I would slip out of bed while Connor slept, his arm always reaching across to my side even in unconsciousness, searching for warmth that had already left for the kitchen table. Those early hours were mine alone, before the world woke up, before Sydney inserted herself into every decision, before the company became something unrecognizable. I would brew instant coffee, we couldn't afford anything better, and open my laptop to dozens of emails from suppliers in Bangladesh, Vietnam, and India who were just ending their workdays. The kitchen table served as our first office, constantly buried under fabric samples, shipping invoices, and sketch pads filled with designs I'd work on between supply chain negotiations. I taught myself Mandarin phrases to better communicate with Mrs. Chin in Guangzhou, who would eventually become our most important fabric supplier. She would stay on video calls past midnight her time, her daughter Amy translating the technical details while Mrs. Chin held up different fabric samples to her webcam, explaining through gestures and broken English why the sustainable cotton blend would revolutionize our production line. Connor believed in the vision then, or at least I thought he did. He would bring me toast around 7, kiss the top of my head, and review the business plan I'd spent 3 weeks perfecting. Sydney was barely a footnote in those early days. She taught yoga at the community center and occasionally stopped by to ask if we could make athletic wear that aligned chakras or incorporated healing crystals. We would smile and nod, then get back to the real work of building a company. The Wednesday that changed our trajectory came 6 months into our venture. Mrs. Chin had sent samples of a revolutionary bamboo cotton blend that would cut our costs by $40,000 annually while maintaining the quality our emerging customer base expected. I was on a video call with her, Amy translating rapidly as we negotiated minimum order quantities, when Connor and Sydney started arguing in the next room. "Why do we need all these foreign relationships?" Sydney's voice carried through the thin walls. "My friend Karen from the farmer's market sells organic cotton. It's basically the same thing and we'd be supporting local businesses." Connor's response was muffled, but I heard Sydney interrupt him. "Aubrey's making this too complicated. Fashion is about intuition, not spreadsheets." I muted my microphone, apologizing to Mrs. Chin with hand gestures while I listened to my husband, the man who had promised to always have my back, fail to defend the months of work I'd put into building our supply chain. When I returned to the call, Mrs. Chin seemed to understand without explanation. She had built her own business in a world that often dismissed women's expertise. We concluded our deal with mutual respect that Sydney would never understand and Connor would never fully appreciate. Family dinners at the Fitzgerald house became exercises in restraint. Marcus, Sydney's father, had made his money in commercial real estate and fancied himself a business genius despite never having created anything himself. He would raise his wine glass every Sunday toasting his daughter's company, while I sat silently, my jaw clenched so tight I'd have headaches for hours afterward. Sydney was just telling us about the sustainable production model she discovered during her meditation retreat. Patricia, their mother, would say while passing the potatoes. So innovative, sweetheart. Sydney would launch into elaborate stories about how she intuited the perfect fabric combinations through spiritual connection with the earth, while I bit my tongue hard enough to taste copper. Connor's hand would find mine under the table, squeezing gently, not in solidarity I later realized, but in warning to stay quiet. After dinner, Patricia would always ask me to help clear the plates. "The men need to talk business," she would say, though I was the only one who actually understood our operations. I would stand at their sink, washing dishes by hand because their dishwasher was temperamental, listening to Marcus advise Connor about keeping women from getting too emotional about business decisions. The night I knew things were truly changing came 3 months before the termination. I was in our warehouse, really just a converted storage unit in an industrial district, surrounded by boxes of samples for our spring collection. The calculator showed it clearly. We were finally profitable. Not just breaking even, not just surviving, but actually making money. Real profit that meant we could move somewhere without chemical smells, maybe even take a vacation that didn't involve visiting suppliers. Connor found me there at 11 p.m., tears streaming down my face as I stared at those numbers. But instead of celebrating with me, instead of acknowledging what we'd built, he stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. "Sydney thinks you're too involved in operations," he said, the fluorescent lights flickering above us like a warning I was too exhausted to recognize. "Maybe you should take a step back. Focus on being a wife for a while." I looked at him, then really looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing my husband's face. The man who had once stayed up all night helping me package our first orders, who had believed in this dream when it was just sketches and hope, was suggesting I abandon the company I'd built because his sister felt threatened by my competence. "Focus on being a wife," I repeated, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "While Sydney does what exactly?" He couldn't meet my eyes. "She has vision, Aubrey. Sometimes that's more important than the day-to-day stuff." The day-to-day stuff. That's what he called the supplier relationships I'd cultivated, the production methods I'd developed, the quality control systems I'd implemented. The stuff. Details that didn't matter compared to Sydney's vision of clothing that channeled positive energy. Looking back now, sitting in my new office with that burgundy hoodie framed on my wall, I realize all the signs were there. Every dismissive comment, every credit stolen, every contribution erased. They were all preparing for that moment in the conference room when Sydney would declare my worth as $70 in polyester. The foundation we built together was never truly together. It was mine, built on my expertise and effort, while they watched and waited for the right moment to claim it as theirs. The Monday after Connor suggested I focus on being a wife, I tried logging into our sales database to check the weekend numbers. The same login I'd used every morning for 3 years suddenly showed an error message. "Access denied. Please contact your administrator." I refreshed the page twice, cleared my browser cache, even restarted my laptop. The message remained, red text against a white screen, mocking me. Connor was buttering toast in our narrow kitchen when I asked him about it. He didn't look up from the strawberry jam jar he was struggling to open. "Sydney mentioned something about streamlining permissions," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "For efficiency." Efficiency. I set my laptop on the counter harder than necessary. "I built that database. I need those numbers to coordinate with suppliers. Maybe you're taking this too personally." He finally met my eyes, and something in his expression made my stomach drop. "It's probably just a technical thing. Ask IT." IT support, when I called them 20 minutes later, was a 19-year-old named Derek who sounded genuinely uncomfortable delivering the message. "Ms. Fitzgerald specifically requested your access be limited to basic functions only," he said, then added quietly, "I'm sorry, Aubrey." That came from the top. Sydney had been in the company for 18 months and suddenly she was the top. I discovered the new marketing materials by accident the following Thursday. A delivery person had left 3 boxes in our storage room instead of the main office, and I opened them thinking they were fabric samples. Instead, glossy brochures spilled out, their covers featuring our new spring line with Lumiere fashion. A vision realized, printed in gold letters. My hands trembled as I flipped to the founding team page. Where my photo should have been, next to Connor's, there was a generic stock photo of 3 women in business suits, all looking confidently at something off camera. Sydney's photo dominated the opposite page, accompanied by a bio that made my blood pressure spike with each word. Sydney Fitzgerald, founder and CEO, single-handedly revolutionized sustainable fashion following a spiritual awakening during her travels through India. Her intuitive understanding of global markets and natural gift for design has positioned Lumiere as an industry leader. Single-handedly. I read it 3 times, each repetition feeling like another twist of a knife. Below her fabricated biography, smaller text mentioned Connor as co-founder and Marcus as chairman. My name appeared nowhere. Not in the small print, not in the acknowledgements, not even in the trademark registration information at the bottom. I carried one brochure to Sydney's office, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that matched my accelerated heartbeat. She was on a call when I entered, but I waited, the brochure tight in my grip, until she finished telling someone about her transformative journey into fashion. "These are interesting," I said, placing the brochure on her desk with deliberate calm. "Especially the part where you revolutionized an industry single-handedly." She glanced at it briefly, then returned to organizing papers on her desk. "We needed to simplify the narrative for investors. Too many names confuse the story. The true story? The compelling story." She looked up at me with eyes that held no warmth. "Investors want visionaries, not operational details." "I'm an operational detail?" "Aubrey, don't be dramatic. You know how important you are to the team." "Team? Not the company we built, not the partnership we formed, but the team. Like I was a player she could bench whenever convenient." The trade show in Las Vegas 2 weeks later was when the full scope of Sydney's deception became clear. I was managing our booth, explaining our sustainable practices to potential buyers, when Mr. Patel appeared. He owned one of our key manufacturing facilities in Mumbai, and his innovative dyeing process was essential to our environmental claims. "Aubrey." His face lit up with genuine warmth. "I was hoping to find you. I must tell you, I was very confused yesterday." "Yesterday?" "Your Sydney," she approached me at the evening reception. Introduced herself as the sole founder, claimed she discovered my factory through. He paused, searching for the right words. "Spiritual meditation?" She said the universe guided her to us. My mouth went dry. "She said that." "My friend, you slept on my office couch for 3 days. My wife brought you dal because you forgot to eat while we worked out pricing. You learned basic Hindi to better communicate with my staff." His expression grew concerned. "Is everything all right with the company ownership?" She spoke as if you were never involved. I forced a smile that felt like broken glass. "There have been some organizational changes." Mr. Patel studied my face with the wisdom of someone who had navigated business politics for 30 years. "I see," he said quietly. "You should know, Aubrey, that my loyalty is to people, not companies. I remember who built these relationships." His words stayed with me through the rest of the trade show, through Sydney's presentation where she claimed to have personally visited every factory in our supply chain, through Connor's speech about their family's commitment to ethical fashion. I stood in the back of the room, invisible, watching my work get attributed to someone who couldn't even locate Mumbai on a map without Google. Patricia Fitzgerald's 60th birthday party was held at their colonial-style house in Westchester, complete with catered appetizers and a string quartet playing in the garden. I wore the navy dress Connor had bought me for our anniversary, trying to blend in among their country club friends and business associates. I was refilling my wine glass when Patricia cornered me in the kitchen. "Aubrey, dear, could you help me with something in the powder room?" Confused but polite, I followed her down the hallway lined with family photos that conspicuously included no pictures of Connor and me together. She led me into the guest bathroom and closed the door behind us, the soft click of the lock sharp in the sudden silence. "Sydney tells me you'll be stepping back from the company soon," she said, adjusting her pearl necklace in the mirror. The vanity lights cast harsh shadows across her carefully made-up face. "I'm sorry, what?" "To focus on starting a family." She said you've been discussing it with Connor. The lie was so bold, so completely fabricated that I actually laughed. "We've never discussed that." Patricia turned to face me fully. "Well, perhaps you should. Sydney has always been the business mind in the family. Even as a child, she had such vision, such leadership qualities." Through the door, I could hear Connor's laugh, followed by Sydney's voice saying something about emotional people not understanding corporate culture. The words were muffled, but the meaning was clear. "With all due respect, Patricia, Sydney was teaching part-time yoga when I built our supply chain. Her expression hardened. Built is such a strong word, dear. From what I understand, you've been helping with administrative tasks. Administrative tasks. 4 years of 18-hour days reduced to filing and phone calls in their revisionist history. Is that what Sydney told you? Sydney doesn't have to tell me anything. I can see what's happening. You're trying to take credit for my daughter's success, and frankly, it's embarrassing. The bathroom suddenly felt too small, the floral wallpaper too busy, the scent of Patricia's perfume too cloying. I reached for the door handle. Where are you going? Back to the party. To my husband. Your husband, she said with emphasis that made the title sound temporary, understands family loyalty. I left her in the bathroom, walked through her perfect house with its perfect furniture and perfect guests, and found Connor on the patio, surrounded by Sydney's friends, laughing at another story about my emotional response to a supplier issue. He didn't notice when I left early. Or maybe he did and just didn't care enough to follow. I drove home from Patricia's party alone that night, taking the long route through empty suburban streets while Connor stayed behind, probably still entertaining Sydney's friends with stories about my emotional inadequacies. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. when I pulled into our apartment complex, and I sat in the car for another 10 minutes, staring at our lit kitchen window, wondering when home had stopped feeling safe. Tuesday morning arrived with unusual quiet. Connor had already left when I woke, his coffee mug abandoned in the sink, no note explaining his early departure. At the office, something felt different the moment I walked through the door. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Eyes darted away from mine. The usual morning greetings were replaced with uncomfortable silence. Emma, Sydney's assistant, appeared at my desk at 10 a.m. She usually bounced when she walked, all 23-year-old enthusiasm and fresh college optimism. Today she moved like someone approaching a funeral, her hands clutching a single piece of paper. Sydney needs you in the executive conference room at 3, she said, looking somewhere past my left shoulder. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Is everything okay, Emma? She shifted her weight, still avoiding eye contact. Just, the meeting. 3 o'clock. That's when I noticed it. A banker's box tucked under my desk, positioned where I couldn't miss it but trying to look casual, like it had always been there. The kind of box people use when they're packing up their lives in a hurry. Emma, what's going on? I have to go, she said, already backing away. 3 o'clock. Don't be late. I watched her practically run back to her desk, where she bent over her computer with the kind of intense focus people adopt when they're desperately trying not to be involved in something. Around the office, I noticed other strange behaviors. The newest intern, Jake, was whispering urgently to another junior employee, both of them glancing my way. When I stood up, they scattered like startled birds. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel in accounting. Everyone's been told to stay visible this afternoon. Something's happening. I knew then. The banker's box, Emma's avoidance, the orchestrated visibility. They were setting up my public execution. Sydney wanted witnesses. At 2:45 I walked to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. My reflection looked tired but determined, like someone preparing for battle they knew they'd lose but would fight anyway. I fixed my lipstick, straightened my blazer and walked to the conference room with my head high. They were already assembled when I arrived. Sydney at the head of the table, wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Marcus to her right, his attention seemingly absorbed by his phone screen, though I could see his thumb wasn't moving. He was just avoiding looking at me. And Connor, my husband, seated 3 chairs away from Sydney, signing documents without reading them, his wedding ring catching the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Aubrey, Sydney said, her tone suggesting we were about to discuss quarterly projections rather than destroy my life. Please sit. I remained standing. What's this about? She slid something across the glass conference table. A burgundy hoodie, the kind we sold for $90 but probably cost us $8 to make. Tucked into its front pocket was a gift card. The hoodie looked familiar and then I realized why. It was from our reject pile, the ones with slightly crooked seams that we couldn't sell at full price. We're restructuring, Sydney said, her manicured nails tapping against the table in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Your position has become redundant. Redundant. I picked up the hoodie, feeling its cheap polyester blend between my fingers. After 4 years of building this company? We appreciate everything you've done, she continued, though her smirk suggested the opposite. This is your severance package. I pulled out the gift card. $70 to a grocery chain I never shopped at. Not even a round number. Just $70, like someone had grabbed whatever was lying in the office gift drawer. What about my performance bonus? The $270,000 I earned by securing the Chin contract. That's being restructured as well. Sydney's smile widened slightly. Budget constraints. I looked at Connor, then really looked at him. He was still signing papers, his hand moving mechanically across pages. Sydney slid toward him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Connor. He paused for a fraction of a second, then continued signing. It's business, Aubrey. Business. 4 years of building something together, 5 years of marriage, and it was just business. Is this from our reject pile? I held up the hoodie, examining its crooked seam with theatrical interest. Did you specifically choose the ugliest one, or was this just luck? Sydney's smirk faltered for half a second. We thought you'd appreciate having something to remember your time here. Oh, I'll remember everything, I said, folding the hoodie with deliberate precision. Every single thing. Marcus finally looked up from his phone. Security will help you collect your belongings. Security. They'd called security on me like I was some kind of threat, like I might steal staplers or sabotage the computers I'd configured myself. I walked out of that conference room with the hoodie under my arm and the $70 gift card in my pocket, the glass walls ensuring everyone in the office could see my humiliation. They were all watching, pretending to work while stealing glances at the woman being escorted out by security. Tony, the security guard, was waiting at my desk. I'd recommended him for the job 6 months ago when he was struggling after being laid off from his previous position. He couldn't look at me as I began packing my belongings into the banker's box Emma had so thoughtfully provided. My hands shook as I removed the photo from our first fashion show. Connor and me, exhausted but triumphant, surrounded by models wearing designs I'd stayed up 3 nights straight to perfect. Into the box it went, along with my coffee mug, the one Connor had given me that said, "World's Best Wife," in gold letters that were starting to chip. The office was silent except for the sound of my belongings dropping into cardboard. Then suddenly music started playing over the speakers. Goodbye, by the Spice Girls, the volume just loud enough to be noticeable but not quite loud enough to seem deliberate. I looked up and saw Emma at her desk, her face red, studying her computer screen with suspicious intensity. Sydney stood in her office doorway, watching with undisguised satisfaction. I'm sorry, Tony whispered as we walked toward the elevator. This isn't right. I didn't trust myself to speak, just nodded and kept walking. The elevator ride felt endless, descending through floors of the building I'd helped lease, past conference rooms where I'd negotiated deals that built this company, down to the parking garage where my 8-year-old Honda Civic waited in space B26. The same space where Connor had proposed 2 years ago, getting down on one knee beside my car after we'd received our first 6-figure purchase order. The same space where we'd celebrated with champagne from paper cups, planning our future, our company, our life together. I sat in my car, the banker's box on the passenger seat, the burgundy hoodie draped over it like a shroud. The $70 gift card sat on my dashboard and I started laughing. Not happy laughter, but the kind that comes when absurdity exceeds your capacity to process it rationally. $70. After everything I'd built, every relationship I'd cultivated, every sleepless night spent making Sydney's fantasies into reality, they'd calculated my worth at $70 in polyester. The security camera in the corner of the garage recorded everything. My laughter that turned to something between crying and rage, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, my head resting against it while my body shook with emotions I couldn't name. Through my windshield I could see Sydney's office window 5 floors up. She was probably watching, enjoying her victory, celebrating the successful elimination of the woman who knew too much, who'd built too much, who'd become too inconvenient to keep around. But she'd made a mistake. In their arrogance and cruelty, they'd all made a crucial mistake. They'd left me with nothing to lose. I drove home from the parking garage with the banker's box sliding across my passenger seat at every turn, the burgundy hoodie mocking me from where it lay crumpled on top. My apartment was dark when I arrived. Connor still at the office celebrating my elimination with Sydney and Marcus, probably toasting with the champagne they kept for special occasions. I dropped the box by the door and went straight to my laptop, something pulling me toward answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find. The company's shared drive was still accessible from my personal computer, an oversight in their eagerness to humiliate me. I logged in, knowing they'd revoke this access within hours once someone in IT realized their mistake. My fingers moved across folders I'd organized myself over the years, through financial documents, supplier contracts, design specifications until I found something new. A folder created just 3 weeks ago, labeled Company Narrative, Final Version. My cursor hovered over it for a moment. Then I clicked. The document that opened was 42 pages of revisionist history so bold it took my breath away. According to this fiction, Sidney Fitzgerald had single-handedly conceived, developed and built Lumiere fashion from the ground up. She had supposedly traveled to Asia 12 times to establish supplier relationships, developed our sustainable production methods through intensive research and innovation, and created our entire business model during what the document called her entrepreneurial awakening. My name appeared exactly once, buried on page 31, in a section titled, Support Staff and Contractors. I was listed as Aubrey Morrison, temporary administrative consultant who assisted with basic operational tasks during the company's early growth phase. My hands shook so violently that I knocked over the cold coffee sitting beside my laptop. The brown liquid spread across my desk, seeping into the keyboard, but I couldn't move. I just sat there watching coffee drip onto the floor while reading how Sydney had apparently taught herself Mandarin to negotiate with Mrs. Chin, how she'd spent months in Mumbai developing our dye process with Mr. Patel, how her natural business instincts had secured every major contract we'd ever signed. The timestamp showed the document had been created by Sydney and last modified by Marcus 2 days before my termination. They'd been planning this narrative while I was still showing up every day, still building their company, still believing I was part of something. I started taking screenshots of everything, uploading them to 3 different cloud services, emailing them to an old email address Connor didn't know about. Then I began searching through other folders, downloading contracts, correspondence, anything that proved the truth. That's when I found it, buried in a folder marked 2020 Legal Archive, that no one had touched in years. A scanned PDF titled, Partnership Agreement, Initial Formation. My breathing stopped as I opened it. There, in black and white with a notary seal at the bottom, was the original agreement establishing Lumiere Fashion. Dated January 15, 2020, signed by Marcus Fitzgerald and me, granting me 23% ownership of all intellectual property developed for or by the company. Not employment. Not a contractor agreement. Marcus's signature was clear and decisive at the bottom, right next to mine. The document had never been superseded, never amended, never replaced. They'd simply forgotten it existed, assumed I'd never look for it, or maybe thought I was too trusting to use it. I made 17 copies that night. One went into a safety deposit box at a bank Connor didn't know I used. Another to my mother's attic, hidden inside a box of my high school yearbooks. I uploaded encrypted copies to cloud services, emailed them to myself at multiple addresses, even printed physical copies that I hid throughout the apartment like a paranoid person preparing for war. Because that's what this was now. 3 days later, I sat at my mother's kitchen table in Queens, watching her pour chamomile tea into the good china she only used for serious conversations. She hadn't said much when I called, just told me to come over and bring my appetite. I never liked him, she said without preamble, setting down a plate of homemade cookies I couldn't eat. Connor. From the first time you brought him here. Mom. Let me finish. She sat across from me, her weathered hands wrapped around her own teacup. He talked over you at dinner. Took credit for your story about landing your first client, pretending he'd been the one to make the connection. You kept looking at him, waiting for him to correct himself, but he never did. She stood and walked to her junk drawer, the one that held everything from rubber bands to expired coupons, and pulled out a small notebook with flowers on the cover. What's that? Evidence, she said, sitting back down and opening it to reveal pages of her careful handwriting. Every time he diminished you. Every family gathering where he made you sound like his assistant instead of his partner. Every time that sister of his acted like you were the help. I flipped through the pages, seeing dates and quotes and observations going back 3 years. Mom, why didn't you say anything? Would you have listened? You were in love. You had dreams. Sometimes children need to learn their own lessons. She reached across the table and took my hand. But I knew this day would come. People like them always show their true colors eventually. He was right. Every slight was there in her careful documentation. Connor explaining our idea that I'd developed alone. Sydney asking me to take notes during meetings I was supposed to be leading. Marcus referring to me as Connor's wife, instead of by my name or title. There's an attorney, my mother said. Patricia Hendricks. She helped Mrs. Chen's daughter with her business dispute last year. Mr. Patel recommended her when I called him. You called Mr. Patel? I called everyone. Mrs. Chen, Mr. Patel, that fabric supplier from Vietnam whose name I can't pronounce. They're all furious about what happened to you. He squeezed my hand. You have more allies than you think. Patricia Hendricks's office occupied the 20th floor of a Manhattan building with views of the Hudson River. She was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything about me in the first 3 seconds after her assistant showed me in. I laid out everything on her conference table. The partnership agreement, the false narrative, screenshots of the real history, my mother's notebook of observations. Patricia examined each document with the focus of someone defusing a bomb, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When she finally looked up, she was almost smiling. They made 3 mistakes, she said, leaning back in her leather chair. They underestimated you, they got sloppy, and they put it in writing. Is the partnership agreement enforceable? Enforceable? He actually laughed. This agreement means you own 23% of all intellectual property. Based on their own valuations for the Series B, that's approximately $27 million in IP. Your share is worth about $6.2 million. The number hung in the air between us, impossible and real at the same time. They can't raise funds with unclear ownership, Patricia continued. No investor will touch them once they know about this. You have them trapped. She stood and walked to her wall of diplomas, the afternoon sun turning them golden. The question is, what do you want? Money? Recognition? To destroy them completely? I thought about Sydney's smirk as she slid that hoodie across the table. Connor signing papers without looking at me. Marcus pretending his phone was fascinating while my life collapsed. I want what's mine, I said. And I want them to know that their $70 wasn't enough to make me disappear. Patricia turned back to me with the expression of someone who'd just been handed their favorite type of case. Then let's make sure they never forget your name again. Patricia Hendricks leaned forward across her conference table, her fingers steepled as she laid out the strategy. We wait, she said, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had played this game before. We let them get comfortable, let them move forward with their plans, and then we strike when it will hurt the most. I left her office with a timeline in my head and a cold determination in my chest. 3 months until their Series B presentation. 3 months to gather everything we needed. 3 months to pretend I had simply disappeared while building a case that would destroy their carefully constructed lies. The first test came 2 weeks later at the monthly Fitzgerald family dinner. Connor had been texting me, begging me to keep up appearances while we figured things out. I agreed, but not for the reasons he thought. I arrived at Patricia and Marcus's colonial house wearing my best smile and a dress Connor had never seen before. One I'd bought with my own money, not the company card Sydney had revoked. The dining room smelled of pot roast and privilege, Patricia's good china gleaming under the chandelier that had been in Marcus's family for 3 generations. Aubrey, Sydney said as I entered, her voice dripping with false warmth. So glad you could make it. I wasn't sure you'd have time now that you're between opportunities. I took my seat across from her, accepting the wine Connor poured with hands that barely trembled. Actually, I've been catching up on my reading. That Fashion Weekly interview you did was fascinating. Her eyes lit up, mistaking my interest for admiration. Oh, you saw that? Every word. Especially the part where you talked about intuiting the supply chain through meditation. Such a unique approach to international business. Connor shifted uncomfortably beside me, but Sydney was already launching into her story, elaborating on how she had spiritually connected with suppliers across Asia without ever leaving the country. It's amazing, I said, pulling out my phone to check a message, but actually hitting record on the voice memo app. You've never actually been to any of these factories? Why would I need to? Sydney laughed, wine making her careless. That's what video calls are for. Besides, I find physical travel limits the spiritual connection. Patricia nodded approvingly while Marcus carved the roast, And I documented every word of Sydney admitting she'd never met the suppliers she claimed to have discovered. Connor kept trying to catch my eye, sensing something was wrong but not understanding what. "You're so quiet lately," Patricia observed, passing me the green beans. "Everything all right?" "Just processing some changes," I said, calculating that we were exactly 73 days from the Series B presentation. Sometimes silence is more valuable than words. After dinner, I excused myself to the bathroom and immediately forwarded the recording to Patricia Hendricks. My phone buzzed with her response. "Perfect. Keep going." The real work happened in my kitchen at 2 in the morning. My laptop opened to WhatsApp while I navigated time zones that had become as familiar as my own neighborhood. Mrs. Chen's face filled the screen, her expression fierce despite the pixelated connection. "She said what?" Mrs. Chen's accent thickened with anger. "Spiritual guidance led her to my factory? I built this business with my husband for 20 years. You found us through trade directories and cold calls, Aubrey. You slept on our office floor during contract negotiations." "I know," I said, screenshots of Sydney's false claims spread across my kitchen table. "But I need you to put that in writing." "I'll do more than that." Mrs. Chen held up her phone, showing me an email from Sydney claiming to have been the primary contact since day one. "She sends these lies to my staff. They forward them to me because they know the truth." One by one, suppliers joined our video calls. Mr. Patel from Mumbai, his son Raj, now a corporate lawyer, taking notes on everything. The fabric suppliers from Vietnam, the button manufacturer from Seoul, the zipper company from Osaka. 12 suppliers in total, each one prepared to state that Sydney had never visited, never negotiated, never built anything. "If they don't pay you fairly," Mr. Patel said during one late-night call, his wife bringing him tea in the background, "we terminate our contracts. All of us. Let them explain to investors why their supply chain disappeared overnight." My kitchen table became a war room, covered in phone cards for international calls, printed emails highlighting lies, sticky notes with time zones and names. I lived on coffee and determination, building alliances across continents while Connor slept at his parents' house, still pretending we were working through a rough patch. Wednesday evening, I did something I'd never done before. Followed Sydney to her yoga class. The studio was in Soho, all exposed brick and expensive enlightenment, the kind of place where people paid $40 to sweat in designer workout clothes. I positioned my mat directly behind hers, close enough to hear her conversation with her friend Rebecca before class started. My phone, tucked under my towel, recorded everything. "The Series B is going to change everything," Sydney said, adjusting her rose gold water bottle. "Finally, people will recognize me as the visionary I am." "What about that woman who used to work with you?" Rebecca asked. "Your brother's wife?" Sydney laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut glass. "Getting rid of her was like removing a tumor. She was holding us back with all her spreadsheets and concerns about reality. Some people just don't understand vision." I held warrior pose while she compared me to cancer, breathing through the rage that wanted to explode out of every pore. Her Lululemon outfit probably cost $400, more than 5 times the severance she'd given me. The final confrontation with Connor came 6 weeks into my 3-month silence. He showed up at my mother's house uninvited, holding grocery store flowers that were already wilting, their discount sticker still visible on the plastic wrapping. "We need to talk," he said when my mother reluctantly let him in. I met him at the door, not inviting him past the entrance. "About what?" "About us. About fixing this." He tried to hand me the flowers, but I didn't take them. I didn't know what Sydney was planning. I was caught in the middle. "You sat there and watched her humiliate me. You signed papers without reading them." "I was trying to keep the peace. You know how my family is." "I know exactly how your family is," I said, pulling the divorce papers from the table by the door where I'd been keeping them for this exact moment. "That's why I'm done with all of you." He looked at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. "You're being vindictive. This is about the money, isn't it? The bonus. The bonus you let them steal? That's company money now," he said, his mask finally slipping. "You need to accept that and move on." I handed him the papers, watching his face crumble as he realized I was serious. "I am moving on. Sign these and leave." "Aubrey, please." "Sign them, Connor. Or I'll have them served at your office. Your choice." He signed them there in my mother's doorway, his hand shaking as he realized that his sister's ambition had cost him his marriage. When he finished, he looked at me one last time. "She's going to destroy you," he said quietly. "Sydney doesn't lose." I smiled then, thinking of the partnership agreement hidden in 17 different locations, of the suppliers ready to revolt, of Patricia Hendricks preparing our case like a surgeon preparing for a life-saving operation. "We'll see about that." I closed the door behind Connor and stood in my mother's entryway, listening to his car pull away from the curb. The divorce papers felt heavy in my hand, their weight representing more than just the end of a marriage. They were the first concrete step toward reclaiming everything they had taken from me. The next morning I drove to Delaware. The 3-hour drive gave me time to think, to plan, to transform from Aubrey Morrison the discarded wife into something else entirely. The lawyer's office sat in a strip mall between a tax preparation service and a nail salon, deliberately unremarkable, the kind of place where business entities were born without fanfare. The attorney, Mr. Brennan, had done this thousands of times before. His office walls were beige, his desk was beige, even his coffee mug was beige. Everything designed to be forgotten the moment you walked out. His assistant offered me coffee in a mug that read "World's Best Boss." The irony not lost on me as I prepared to become exactly that for the first time in my life. Meridian Holdings LC. I told him when he asked for the company name. I had chosen it carefully. Meridians were invisible lines that defined everything on a map, determining location, ownership, boundaries. Just like I was about to define who really owned what in the mess Sydney had created. "Purpose of the business?" Mr. Brennan asked, fingers poised over his keyboard. "Asset management and intellectual property holdings." He didn't ask more questions, just typed efficiently while I signed document after document, each signature moving me closer to my goal. Within an hour, Meridian Holdings LLC existed, a legal entity that would soon own 23% of Lumiere Fashion's intellectual property. Sydney had no idea that while she was giving interviews about her visionary leadership, I was creating the weapon that would destroy her carefully constructed empire. 2 weeks before the Series B presentation, Patricia Hendricks called me to her office at midnight. The building was nearly empty, just security guards and cleaning crews, the perfect environment for what we needed to do. "We're going to rehearse every possible scenario," Patricia said, spreading documents across her conference table. The city lights glowed through her floor-to-ceiling windows, making Manhattan look like a circuit board powering our plan. Sydney might cry, might threaten, might try to negotiate on the spot. You need to be prepared for anything. We role-played for hours, Patricia alternating between Sydney's probable responses and the investor's likely questions. She taught me to keep my breathing steady when confrontation came, to maintain eye contact without blinking, to let silence do the heavy lifting when words would only complicate things. "What if she calls me directly?" I asked, pushing aside an empty container of lo mein. "You don't answer. Let her spiral. Let her leave voicemails that we can document as evidence of consciousness of guilt. What if Connor tries to intervene?" Connor signed the divorce papers. He has no standing anymore. He chose his side. We practiced until 3 in the morning, empty Chinese takeout containers creating a timeline of our preparation. Patricia showed me exactly when she would send the email to investors. 11:47 a.m., precisely 15 minutes into Sydney's presentation, after she had made her claims but before she could close the deal. "The timing has to be perfect," Patricia explained, her finger tracing the agenda we had obtained through a contact at the venue. "Too early and they might postpone. Too late and some investors might have already committed verbally." 3 days before the presentation, I visited the Meridian Hotel. The lobby was all marble and crystal, the kind of place that whispered money with every surface. I needed to find the perfect vantage point, somewhere I could watch the destruction unfold without being immediately visible. The lobby cafe sat adjacent to the ballroom, separated by floor-to-ceiling windows that allowed diners to see inside during events. I tested several tables before finding the perfect one. Corner position, partially hidden behind a decorative plant, but with clear sightlines to both the presentation stage and the investor seating area. The barista, a young woman named Elena with kind eyes and an Eastern European accent, noticed me testing the Wi-Fi strength at various spots. "Important video call?" she asked. "Something like that. I need to be here next Thursday around 11. This exact table. Big presentation happening that day," Elena said, nodding toward the ballroom. Some fashion company. They've booked the whole space. I pulled out the $70 gift card Sydney had given me as severance, the plastic worn from being carried in my pocket like a talisman. Can I use this to reserve the table? Maybe order something special that day. Elena looked at the card, then at me, and something in her expression suggested she understood more than I had said. I'll make sure this table is yours. Would you like me to prepare your coffee at exactly 11:30? 11:45 would be perfect. The irony of using Sydney's insulting severance to buy the coffee I would drink while watching her downfall felt like poetry. The final family photograph happened the Sunday before everything changed. Patricia Fitzgerald had insisted on it, claiming they needed an updated portrait for their holiday cards. The real reason, I suspected, was Sydney wanting to document her triumph before the Series B funding came through. The photographer arranged us in Patricia's living room, everyone wearing coordinated shades of blue and cream, except for me. I had worn the burgundy hoodie under my blazer, hidden but present, like the truth waiting to emerge. The polyester felt scratchy against my skin, a constant reminder of what they had reduced me to. Aubrey, could you remove your blazer? The photographer asked. The black doesn't quite match the color scheme. I'm cold, I lied, pulling it tighter around me. Sydney stood in the center of the arrangement, radiant in her designer dress, surrounded by her parents and Connor like they were her court. Connor's hand rested on my shoulder, but it felt like a stranger's touch, the weight of it making me want to shrug away. His wedding ring caught the photographer's lights, the same ring he had slipped on my finger 5 years ago while promising to love, honor, and protect. Everyone smile, the photographer commanded. Think happy thoughts. I smiled and thought about the email Patricia would send in 94 hours. Sydney beamed beside me, unaware that this would be the last photo where she would look victorious. Patricia commented on how perfect we all looked, how blessed they were to have such a successful family. One more, the photographer said. This time, everyone look at Sydney. She's the star of the show. We all turned toward her, and in that moment, I memorized her expression. The self-satisfaction, the arrogance, the complete certainty that she had won. I wanted to remember exactly how she looked before everything she had stolen got ripped away. After the photos, as everyone dispersed to the dining room for lunch, Sydney pulled me aside in the hallway. No hard feelings about the job thing, right? She said, not really asking. It was just business. You understand. I looked at her, this woman who had systematically destroyed my career while smiling at family dinners, and felt nothing but cold determination. I understand perfectly, I said. She patted my arm condescendingly and walked away, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. 89 hours until the presentation. 89 hours until the truth would finally matter more than the narrative. 89 hours until Sydney learned that $70 and a polyester hoodie were not enough to buy my silence or my disappearance. I left the Fitzgerald house that Sunday with 89 hours on my mental clock, each tick bringing me closer to the moment when truth would finally matter more than perception. Monday passed in a blur of final preparations with Patricia, confirming that every document was ready, every supplier statement notarized, every piece of evidence organized for maximum impact. Tuesday felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing the jump was coming but not quite ready for the free fall. Wednesday night I didn't sleep at all. Thursday morning arrived gray and humid, the kind of weather that makes Manhattan feel claustrophobic. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple black dress that would let me blend into the Meridian Hotel's upscale crowd. The burgundy hoodie stayed in my bag, a reminder of why I was doing this. I arrived at the hotel at 10:45, giving myself time to settle at my reserved table in the cafe before Sydney's grand performance began. Elena, the barista, recognized me immediately and had my table ready with a small reserved sign that she removed as I sat down. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the ballroom filling with investors, venture capitalists whose combined net worth could probably buy small countries. They chatted over coffee and pastries, checking phones and adjusting ties, completely unaware they were about to witness corporate fraud exposed in real time. At 11 o'clock sharp, Sydney made her entrance. Even from across the lobby, I could see the confidence in her stride as she walked onto the stage. She wore a cream-colored suit that I recognized from the Nordstrom expense reports, $3,000 charged to the company card under client meeting attire. Her presentation slides appeared on the massive screen behind her, our logo prominent, though she had redesigned it slightly to remove elements I had created. Good morning. Her voice carried through the ballroom sound system, clear and practiced. I'm Sydney Fitzgerald, founder and CEO of Lumiere Fashion, and today I'm going to show you how one woman's vision is revolutionizing sustainable fashion. One woman's vision. I stirred my coffee slowly, watching her click through slides showing our supply chain, the one I had spent 3 years building through late-night negotiations and countless international calls. She described visiting factories she had never seen, developing relationships with suppliers she couldn't name without her notes, pioneering sustainable practices she learned about from my reports. Through my intuitive understanding of global markets, Sydney continued, gesturing at a map dotted with our supplier locations, I personally established partnerships across 12 countries, creating a network that gives us unprecedented control over quality and sustainability. Marcus sat in the front row, his chest puffed with pride as his daughter spun her fiction. Connor was nowhere to be seen, probably too ashamed or too smart to attend. The investors took notes, some nodding appreciatively at Sydney's polished delivery. She had rehearsed this thoroughly, every gesture calculated, every pause strategic. 20 minutes into her presentation, as she was explaining our revenue projections, Gregory Aldridge from Apex Capital raised his hand. He was a legend in venture capital, someone who had built and destroyed fortunes with single decisions. His gray hair and expensive suit gave him an air of authority that made the room pay attention when he spoke. Miss Fitzgerald, he said, his tone conversational, almost bored. I notice you terminated your chief operations officer, Aubrey Morrison, 3 months ago. Can you speak to that transition? Sydney didn't miss a beat. Her response was so smooth, so rehearsed, that she might have been reading from a script. Aubrey was a temporary consultant who assisted with some administrative functions early on. Her role became redundant as we scaled. We parted ways amicably. From my position in the cafe, I could see 2 investors in the third row exchange glances. One of them, a woman in a navy suit, made a note on her tablet. Even from this distance I could read her body language. She was marking this as a potential red flag. Aldridge nodded slowly, making his own notes, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with the answer. Sydney continued her presentation, moving on to market opportunities and growth projections. The confidence returned to her voice as she left the dangerous territory of my termination behind. She was clicking to her slide about international expansion when I saw Patricia's message appear on my phone. Sending now. At exactly 11:47 a.m., Patricia's email arrived in 60 inboxes simultaneously. I watched as phones began buzzing around the room, investors discreetly checking their devices despite Sydney's continued presentation. Aldridge was the first to fully engage with his phone, his expression shifting from polite attention to sharp focus as he read. The email contained everything: the partnership agreement proving my 23% ownership, documentation showing I had built every supplier relationship, emails from Marcus calling me co-founder, the false company narrative Sydney had created, and most devastatingly, sworn statements from 12 suppliers confirming they would terminate contracts if I wasn't fairly compensated. Aldridge stood up slowly, his movement deliberate enough that Sydney stopped mid-sentence about projected returns. The entire room turned to look at him, this titan of venture capital who rarely showed emotion during pitches. Miss Fitzgerald, he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made grown executives nervous. I've just received some rather interesting documentation about your company's founding structure. Sydney's face showed the first crack in her composure. I'm not sure what you mean. According to these documents, Aldridge continued, holding up his phone, you systematically erased your co-founder from the company history, someone who actually built your supply chain and owns 23% of your intellectual property. The same person you just called a temporary consultant. The room erupted in whispered conversations. Sydney's face drained of color as she gripped the podium. There must be some misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, Aldridge interrupted, his voice now sharp as a blade, is that you thought you could lie to this room about who built what. I have signed statements from 12 of your key suppliers saying they'll terminate contracts if Ms. Morrison isn't fairly compensated. That means your entire supply chain, the one you just spent 20 minutes claiming you built through spiritual intuition, is about to disappear. Marcus had collapsed forward in his chair, his head in his hands. Other investors were now standing, phones pressed to ears as they called their legal teams. Someone near the back was already heading for the exit. "This isn't just misrepresentation," Aldridge continued, his voice filling the growing chaos. "This is securities fraud. You stood on that stage and lied about fundamental aspects of your business while seeking investment. That's a federal crime, Miss Fitzgerald." Sydney's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, her carefully constructed world collapsing in front of 60 witnesses. Through the windows across the lobby our eyes met. She saw me sitting at my corner table, coffee cup raised slightly in what could only be described as a toast. Her face contorted with rage and recognition as she realized I had orchestrated this moment. The investor exodus began immediately. They filed out with the urgency of people fleeing a building fire, their conversations a mix of anger and self-preservation. Sydney stood frozen at her podium, the presentation slides still showing behind her. Projections for a company that had just ceased to exist as a viable investment. She started screaming my name, pointing toward the cafe, telling security to stop me, that I had done something illegal, that they needed to call the police. But I was already standing, leaving cash on the table for Elena, walking calmly toward the exit as Sydney's hysterical voice echoed behind me. Security guards looked confused, unsure why they should detain someone for drinking coffee in a public cafe. Several investors passed me on their way out and I heard one say to another, "Morrison? Isn't that the woman who actually built their supply chain?" I pushed through the hotel's revolving door and into the humid Thursday morning, Sydney's presentation folder tucked under my arm, the one she had left on the podium in her panic, now evidence of her lies. Behind me, her empire was crumbling, built on stolen foundations that had finally been reclaimed. The humid Manhattan air clung to my skin as I walked away from the Meridian Hotel, Sydney's presentation folder still tucked under my arm. My phone was already vibrating with calls from Patricia Hendricks, but I needed a moment to breathe, to process what had just happened. I ducked into a Starbucks 3 blocks away and finally answered. "They're panicking," Patricia said without preamble. "Marcus has already called twice and their lawyer is trying to negotiate. They're starting at $300,000. I actually laughed, sitting at a corner table while business people rushed around me, oblivious to my life changing in real time. $300,000 for 23% of $27 million in intellectual property? That's what I told them. I countered at $6.2 million. Full payment for your ownership stake plus the stolen bonus plus damages. They have 72 hours before we file publicly and contact every fashion publication about what really happened." My phone buzzed with another call trying to break through. Connor's name flashed on the screen. I'd been declining his calls since leaving the hotel, but they kept coming, 5, 10, 15 attempts. On his 48th try that afternoon I finally answered. "Aubrey, please," he sobbed before I could speak. "You're destroying my family. My mother is having a breakdown. Sydney's locked herself in her apartment. My father won't speak to anyone." I stood up and walked outside, needing space for this conversation. "Your family destroyed themselves, Connor. I just showed everyone what they did. We can fix this. We can work something out. This doesn't have to end like." You sat 3 chairs away while Sydney handed me a hoodie and $70. You signed papers without reading them. You watched your family erase me from the company I built and said nothing. I was trying to. You were trying to keep your comfortable position in a family that values loyalty over truth. How's that working out for you now? He was quiet for a moment, just his ragged breathing through the phone. "Sydney says you planned this whole thing. That you set us up. I documented the truth. If that destroyed you, maybe you should examine what you were built on." He hung up without another word. I blocked his number while standing on that busy Manhattan sidewalk, deleting 5 years of marriage with a single tap. The next 3 days passed in a blur of legal calls and increasingly desperate offers. 400,000, 800,000, 1.5 million. Each rejection from Patricia made them raise their bid, the reality of their situation becoming clearer with each passing hour. The suppliers had already started making noise about contract terminations. 2 investors were threatening lawsuits for fraud. The fashion press had begun sniffing around the story. At 4:47 p.m. on the 3rd day, Patricia called with finality in her voice. "They accepted. $6.2 million. The wire transfer is processing." I was sitting in my Honda Civic in my mother's driveway when the notification appeared on my banking app. I refreshed it 12 times, each time expecting the numbers to disappear like some kind of glitch. But they remained. $6,200,000 sitting in my account like a foreign language I was still learning to read. My hands shook as I called my mother. She answered on the first ring, having been waiting by the phone. "It's done," I said, my voice cracking. "I won." She started crying immediately. "Oh, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you. You stood up to them. You fought back. I can pay off your mortgage now," I said, tears running down my face. "Buy you that car you always talk about. Take you to Paris like we used to dream about when I was little." "I don't care about any of that," she said through her tears. "I care that you know your worth now. That you wouldn't let them diminish you." I sat in that Civic one last time, remembering all the drives to work, all the nights I'd cried in this driver's seat, all the moments I'd felt small and worthless. The next day I traded it in for something that didn't carry those memories. 6 months later, my life looked nothing like the woman who'd been handed a hoodie and told she was worth $70. My penthouse apartment overlooked Central Park with floor-to-ceiling windows that actually opened, letting in fresh air whenever I wanted it. My home office, where I ran Morrison's sustainable fashion consulting, had become command central for a business that was thriving beyond my wildest expectations. The suppliers I'd cultivated over the years had become my first clients. Mrs. Chin flew in from Guangzhou for my launch party. Mr. Patel sent his son to discuss expanding our partnership. The same people Sydney claimed to have discovered through meditation now worked exclusively with me, helping other fashion startups build ethical, sustainable supply chains. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was doing exactly what I'd done at Lumiere, except now I owned it all. Every relationship, every innovation, every success had my name on it in writing, properly documented and legally protected. Fashion Weekly reached out requesting an interview about women supporting women in business, particularly interested in my journey from corporate fashion to independent consulting. I declined the interview but sent them a photo that told the real story. Me wearing the burgundy hoodie with my new company's logo embroidered over the original Lumiere branding. The caption read simply, "From $70 to 7 figures. A story of knowing your worth." The photo went viral in fashion circles. Sydney's company valuation, already damaged by the investor scandal, dropped another $30 million when the true story began circulating. She'd had to sell her majority stake to Marcus to pay my settlement and keep the company afloat. Last I heard, she was working as a wellness consultant, which seemed fitting for someone who'd built an empire on meditation and fiction. The burgundy hoodie now hangs in my closet between designer dresses and the leather jacket I bought to celebrate my first million in consulting fees. It's not hidden away in shame or anger, but displayed prominently where I see it every morning. During video calls with clients, when they ask about it, I tell them the truth. It's my most expensive piece of clothing, a $6 million reminder of what happens when you know your value and refuse to accept less. Sometimes at night, when the city lights blur through my windows and sleep won't come, I still dream about Connor's laugh from our early days, before money and family loyalty poisoned everything we'd built. I wonder if he ever thinks about that apartment above the dry cleaners, about the dreams we sketched on napkins, about the life we could have had if he'd chosen his wife over his sister's ambition. But those dreams fade with morning light, replaced by the reality I've built from the ashes they left behind. The hoodie remains, transformed from an insult into armor, from $70 of dismissal into millions in vindication. They thought they were erasing me, but instead they freed me to write my own story. And this version, the one where I own every word, every relationship, every success, this version is the truth. If this story of calculated revenge struck a chord with you, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Aubrey raised her cappuccino in a silent toast while watching Sydney's empire crumble through the hotel window. What was your favorite moment of justice served? Drop it in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell to catch more gripping stories of underdogs who refuse to be erased.